So, our final speaker of the night is Tony Karam. Tony is an ASF dad, founder of Casa Tibet Mexico, and was a direct disciple of the Dalai Lama. After an extensive academic training in Tibet, Nepal, and the United States, and under the suggestion of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama and the Office of Tibet in New York, Tony Karam founded the Tibet House Mexico in 1989. Tibet House Mexico is an educational, secular institution and the first official cultural representation of the Tibetan people and His Holiness the Dalai Lama for Mexico and Latin America. Tibet House Mexico and the Metropolitan University were the first to invite His Holiness the Dalai Lama to visit Mexico in July 1989 in order to inaugurate Tibet House Mexico and participate in the International Forum on Global Priorities. Since then, Casa Tibet Mexico has brought His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama on 4 separate occasions, as well as organized visits, talks, and courses by the greatest lamas, spiritual leaders, and Buddhist personalities from all over the world. Please welcome our final speaker of the night, Tony Karam.
Thank you. Well, the good news is that I'm the last. You'll soon be leaving. So I won't take too much of your time. My presentation today is called, if I can make this work, Dreaming Yourself Awake. By training, I'm a Tibetologist, I'm a Buddhologist. My father recurrently says that it would be much easier for me to say I am an urologist. Because essentially nobody truly understands what I do. I specialize in the spiritual and philosophical tradition of Buddhism, particularly the way that it has developed and flourished in the roof of the world, the ancient wisdom civilization of Tibet. As you know, this spiritual tradition is ancient. It arose around 2,600 years ago, basically in northern India, and it is related to the spiritual experiences of a man that we refer to generally as the Buddha. I'm sure that you've heard this word before, but it is very common to misinterpret what the word actually means and the relevance that it has to for our lives. So I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about this. It is said that shortly after his enlightenment, in the 6th century before the Christian era, Siddhartha Gautama, that is the historic Buddha, dwelt in a primeval forest in northern India, where he was engaged in absorptive meditation related to the cultivation of very profound states of one-pointed concentration, which are related to an exceptional state of refinement of the attention that also produced an interesting side effect, what we call bioluminescence. We know that this phenomenon exists in nature. It is manifest in certain types of organisms, as in deep sea or abyssal fish. We know that it also manifests in certain vegetables, like some types of fungi. We know that it is also something that can be manifest in some type of turtles and even also in some type of birds. But we thought it was completely absent from the human condition. Nonetheless, as you probably have seen, especially in sacred art, it is a phenomenon that is very commonly represented around humans or individuals that have achieved a very exalted level of sanctity or inner purity. So it is said that the historic Buddha, while he dwelt in this primeval forest, immersed in this type of absorptive, one-pointed meditation, displayed this extraordinary faculty and ability, bioluminescence. Literally, he shone. He irradiated some type of spiritual light from his body. And at that time, it is said that a merchant, a Brahmin called Drona, was walking through the forest in the middle of the night and happened to cross his path with a Buddha, immersed in this absorptive meditation. He was surprised and afraid when he witnessed this extraordinary phenomenon, a being that irradiated some type of mysterious light. Of course, he was not familiar with this type of manifestation, but he was a very courageous individual. So, instead of simply running, which is probably what I would have done, he approached the Buddha and he asked him what he was. Of course, he used all the categories that were familiar to his worldview, the ancient Brahmanical spiritual conception of reality. And he first inquired, he first asked Siddhartha, the Buddha, if he was a Gandharva. The word Gandharva in the Sanskrit language basically means some type of angelical being, some type of divine entity. It is said that the Buddha replied negatively, and he said, "No, I'm not a Gandharva." He then asked the Buddha a second question. He extended a second inquiry, and he said, "Well, then tell me, are you a yaksha?" A yaksha is a Sanskrit word that means something like a spirit of nature, something akin to, for instance, the figure or the person of Puck in the Midsummer Night's Dream of Shakespeare, no? That you've probably read or seen in some type of representation. And again, the Buddha said, "No, I'm not a spirit of nature. I'm not a yaksha." So he then asked him again, "Are you a demon?" And the Buddha said, "No, I'm not a demon." "Are you a human being?" The last of his options. And the Buddha, to his amazement, replied, "No, I'm not a human being." And if I place myself in the footsteps of Drona the Brahmin, I would have probably then said, "Then what the hell are you?" No? It is said that the Buddha replied, and then he affirmed, "I'm a Buddha." So what does being a Buddha mean? The word Buddha basically means awake. I am a being who is awake. Now this is something interesting because I would presuppose that we all think of ourselves in that manner. Isn't it so? We conceive of ourselves as lucid. But from the perspective of a Buddha, we are not. We're basically asleep. In what sense? What does it mean to be awake? We can use a metaphor to try to understand the nature of that state, which is related to the topic that has been discussed repeatedly from different angles tonight. Dreaming. This is a state of experience that we all transit to every day. Isn't it so? We go from the waking state to the deep dream state in which most of us simply lose consciousness. We experience some type of deep coma state. And then we transit around 2 hours or maybe an hour and a half after falling asleep into the dream state. This is a very interesting state of experience. Suddenly, we're faced with a great variety of visionary experiences, appearances of different natures. And we can interact with the dream in two basic different ways. We can experience non-lucid dreams, as is the case with most of us, or we can experience the dream state lucidly. What is the difference between one and the other? When we transit the dream state non-lucidly, basically, we experience a temporal limitation, an inability, centered or on an absence of capacity to signal the illusory nature of the dream appearances. Now, if you question yourself about the nature of dreams, especially if you try to analyze them from the perspective of the waking state, we very usually conceive of dreams as unreal. Isn't that so? But in truth, dreams satisfy the most basic criteria, scientific criteria of reality. And this is comprised of two elements. For something to be real, science says, it has to appear at least to one of our sense bases. And second, it has to be able to manifest what we conceive of as the possibility of generating effects. That's called causal efficacy. Now, do dreams comply to this criteria? That is, do they appear to at least one of our different sense bases? Of course they do. They appear to the mind. This is again something interesting and curious, because when we transit through the dream state, specifically when we do so non-lucidly, we think that dreams appear to all of our different sense bases. Isn't that so? In dreams we see. In dreams we hear. In dreams we taste. In dreams we smell. And in dreams we think and feel. Isn't that so? Yet, this is illusory. Because while we're dreaming, our physical sense bases are not active. Which basically means that we're not seeing or hearing or tasting or smelling. But there's one sense basis that is actually operating and functioning in dreams. That is the mind sense. So dreams do appear to at least one of our sense bases, and that is the mind. Isn't that so? Now, do dreams manifest causal efficacy? Do they produce some type of effect in our experience? Of course they do. Depending on what you're exposed to in a dream, the type of dream that you experience, you generate some type of feeling. That feeling can even, transcend the dream state and influence your state of mind in the waking state. So therefore, we would definitely have to conclude that dreams exist. They are real. But here's the thing. Even though dreams exist and are real, they exist and are real as dreams. But they are not real in the sense that they do not exist in the way that they appear. See? So how is it that dreams appear to somebody that is not lucid in them? Well, they seem to exist objectively. That means independently of the person, of the mind, of the dreamer that is experiencing the dreams. Isn't that so? For instance, when you dream, it is self-evident the fact that you're exposed to a great variety of dream appearances. Let's say we were dreaming this auditorium. If you were to dream this auditorium in a non-lucid way, commonly you would think that the auditorium truly exists in the way that it subjectively appears to you, independently of the mind that is dreaming it. Yet, this is illusory, because a dream auditorium is unable to be separated. It is impossible to separate the dream auditorium from the mind that dreams it. Isn't that so? In the dream, you also manifest a personality, an identity. And again, when you're not lucid within the dream, how is it that you conceive and relate to that identity, you generally think that it does possess intrinsic reality, objective reality. But again, the fact is that that identity that you manifest within the dream is merely what we call a mental designation of the mind of the dreamer. The dreamer is generating that identity within the dream. And that identity cannot be separated from the mind that is dreaming it. And finally, within dreams, we also display many different types of activities. Physical activities, verbal activities, emotional activities. And again, how is it that we regard those activities? We, in a non-lucid dream, project upon them objective reality. We think that they appear as they manifest to us, independently of the mind that is dreaming them. This is again an illusion, because there's no activity that we displace in a dream that can be actually separated from the mind that is dreaming it. Dreams exist, but they exist as dreams. But we confuse the nature of dreams, and we project upon them objective reality. We conceive of them as existing independently of the mind that is dreaming them. And what is the effect or the consequence of that type of confusion? Essentially the following. Our experience in dreams, when we're non-lucid, is determined by the appearances of dreams. Therefore, when you have a good dream, you feel well. And when you have a bad dream, you feel bad. But the fact is that there's nothing out there that is actually producing this experience. It is the mind of the dreamer that is generating these, appearances, and it is also producing the feeling that is projected upon them. The problem is that when we're not lucid in a dream, we're unable to establish clearly that difference. And therefore, we become enslaved by the illusory appearances of dreams. The wisdom traditions of the world, and here we include the Buddhist tradition, have asserted for millennia that we can also experience dreams in an alternate way, that within them we can become lucid. What does this basically mean? It means that we can signal, that we can understand the illusory nature of dream appearances, that we have the potentiality to wake up within the dream and understand or apprehend the dream as a dream. That does not mean that we are able to understand that the dream does not exist at all, as we would commonly presuppose. It basically means that we're able to understand and discriminate the nature of dream. Understanding that it does exist, but it doesn't exist as it appears, from its own side, independently of the mind that dreams it. Even though the wisdom traditions of the world have accepted this as a possibility of the human mind, the ability to experience lucid dreams, in our culture, in our Western technological and scientific civilization, the understanding of this phenomenon has taken a long time. It was only until the 1980s, basically as a result of the work of an extraordinary physiologist called Stephen LaBerge from Stanford University, who since his childhood had the natural ability to experience lucid dreams, who designed a scientific experiment that was seminal in the adoption by the medical and biological establishment of the reality of these extraordinary state of mind that is called lucid dreams. And what Dr. Stephen LaBerge designed is the following. He understood as sleep researchers do, that one of the physical correlates that naturally follow dreaming is what's called rapid eye movement. What this means is that when we're basically dreaming, our eyes move randomly from side to side. Do you know why this happens? It happens because the brain is confused. It is unable to distinguish the experiences it is being exposed to in the dream state with the experiences that it is exposed to in the waking state. So then, when in the dream state we're exposed to the visionary experiences of dream, naturally the brain thinks they're endowed with objective reality. And thus, when we're looking at all of these visionary appearances, the eyes naturally move to follow them. This is curious because there's nothing to see. There's no external reality to be perceived within dreams. What the eyes are following are mental impressions, which the mind projects upon the dream state. Nonetheless, it manifests this curious phenomenon that's called rapid eye movement. And what Dr. Stephen LaBerge designed is a very extraordinary experiment. What he did is being able to experience lucid dreams since he was small. When he was introduced or went into the dream state, he was able to control lucidly or consciously the movement of the eyes. And in that way to communicate with the dream researchers, which in the lab were observing him while he was enveloped or immersed in the dream state. And by means of moving his eyes, in some type of Morse elementary code, he was able to communicate to the researchers that he was awake, therefore proving the existence of this extraordinary state called lucid dreaming. See? The Buddhist tradition asserts that there's not a huge difference between the dream state and the waking state, that they're much more similar than what you would think. Usually speaking, it is said that, let me see if this works, that dreaming can be viewed as a special case of perception without the constraints of external sensory input, which basically means that when we're dreaming, everything that appears in the dream state is basically generated by the mind of the dreamer. There's no external world. While perception, like the one that we manifest in the waking state, can be viewed as a special case of dreaming constrained by sensory input, which means that in the wakened state, we are exposed to an external reality that is independent of the person that is dreaming it. Yet, and this is the important fact, no? The experience that we have of that apparent external reality is subject to the interpretation of the perceiver, which means that from that perspective, even though that in the waking state we're exposed to an external reality, we're constrained by external sensory input, it is mind that interprets the nature of that sensory input. And from that perspective, we're dreaming our lives. We're projecting upon the world what we conceive of it. And we are subject repeatedly to a very basic sense of confusion that leads us to think that what we're construing, what we're projecting upon reality, possesses an intrinsic or objective reality. Again, the consequence of this confusion is that we are enslaved by these illusory appearances. And our experience is commonly determined by the world with which we, interact. While in reality, our experience is truly determined by the mind that interprets that world. But this is something that we're not aware of. So, in the Buddhist tradition, for millennium, there has been developed a contemplative science that has as its main objective the ability to use dreams as a way of detonating or propitiating lucidity in the waking state. When the person is trained to become lucid in dreams and is able to recurrently manifest this ability within the dream state, he is simultaneously able to become free, independent of the influence that dreams exerts upon one. Let's take some examples. If you're not lucid and you're dreaming, for instance, an event in an African savanna where perhaps you are exposed to a pack of lions who are hungry and have set their eyes upon you and want to devour you and suddenly run and they're out to get you, what is your response if you're not lucid? Of course, you perceive or conceive of this whole scenery as having objective reality, as existing in the way that it appears to you independently of the mind that is dreaming it. Of course, you're not conscious of the fact that you're dreaming. So then you become anxious, you're afraid, you begin to run for your life, and you try to protect yourself from those animals, isn't so? And you might climb a tree and you might get a gun and try to kill them. So that appearance determines your experience. Now, imagine for a moment that within that environment, that of the dream, you were suddenly able to become lucid, to detonate lucidity, to apprehend the dream as a dream, to understand not that the dream doesn't exist at all, but that it doesn't exist in the way that it appears, independently of the mind that is perceiving it. What would happen? To begin with, you would be able to control the dream appearances. Perhaps you would want to transform those tigers into little kittens. Or perhaps once they were about to pounce upon you and devour you, you could simply fly away into an abyss or transform your body into a light body, and you would be liberated from that danger. Well, think of it from another perspective. Imagine that in a dream you were exposed to a chocolate cake. You were unaware of the fact that you were dreaming, and then you would eat or taste that chocolate cake and suddenly feel the result of that sensory experience, pleasure. And then you were to inquire, to ask yourself, where does the detonator, the cause of this pleasure, lie? What is it that produces that pleasure? In a non-lucid dream, you would say, of course, it is the cake. The cake is the stimuli that generates upon me the pleasure. Isn't that so? But the thing is that there's no cake. What your experience is simply the projection of your mind. Isn't that so? So what is it that is truly producing your pleasure in a dream? It is mind. Mind being the source of that experience. So if you were to become lucid in a dream, you would break all types of dependency in that stimuli. You would understand that your pleasure doesn't depend on the dream appearances, but on the mind that projects meaning upon them. Is that so different from what we experience in the wake state? It is not, you know. Again, the Buddha said that sentient beings suffer because we're subject to ignorance. That ignorance is the basic cause of suffering. But what did he mean by ignorance? That we are unable to recite, I don't know, the poetry of William Blake by heart? Is ignorance understood as our inability to cite the names of the capitals of all the states of Mexico? That is not what the Buddhist tradition understands as ignorance. What it understands as ignorance is a repetitive, habitual inability on behalf of the perceptor of understanding the way things are and being able to distinguish the way they appear from the way they exist. How is it that, the waking appearances manifest to us? Well, everything that we perceive seems to exist objectively, isn't it so? Independently of the mind that is perceiving it. But the truth is that everything that we perceive, without exception, is filtered by your senses, and it's basically filtered by the mind that interprets them. We are projecting upon that environment meaning. We're dreaming our environment every day, instant by instant. But what type of dream are we experiencing? A non-lucid dream. As every night when we dream, very commonly we're unable to activate the mind of lucidity. We're unable to be aware of the fact that we're dreaming, and thus we're enslaved by the dream's appearances. In the waking state, we experience exactly the same. We're dreaming our world, but we're doing it non-lucidly. We're not aware of the fact that everything that we experience is created by the mind. That doesn't mean that we create the external environment, but it does mean that we create the experience that we have of the external environment. And again, how is it that we experience this? Is this lucid or non-lucid? Are we aware of the fact that we're dreaming the world? Or we simply think that the world exists exactly in the way that it appears? So when we talk about ignorance, we divide it in three things. We're unaware of the fact that everything that we interact with is impermanent, changing moment by moment, instant by instant. And not only are we unaware of that, we project upon reality a distorted demand for things that are impermanent to be permanent. Sooner or later, as it is often said, reality bites our ass. Meaning that sooner or later, we have to confront the reality of impermanence. And the more that we resist the impermanent nature of reality, the more we suffer. And this is something that we experience in a non-controllable, recurrent manner. We perceive things that are dependent as independent. We perceive things that are composed of parts and emerge on dependence of causes and circumstances and mental designation as if they existed independently of parts, conditions, and mental designation. We perceive things that don't have an intrinsic identity as if they had an intrinsic identity. We perceive things that lack intrinsic qualities as if they had intrinsic qualities, and thus we suffer. And we do this uncontrollably and repeatedly. This is what the Buddha called ignorance. Now, the good news is that ignorance is not intrinsic to our nature. This reminds me of a joke that I heard some years ago. And please forgive me, I have to tell it in Spanish because it doesn't translate. So it's a joke about this priest from the Legionaries of Christ that is invited from Scotland to Mexico, never learns the Spanish language too well, and is the leader of this, Christian community in some part of the state of Jalisco. The priest was called Father O'Malley. So the joke says that Father O'Malley was giving this sermon in Holy Week, talking about the miracle of the resurrection of Lazarus. No? And he said something like this to his followers, no? And then Lazarus told Jesus Christ told Lazarus, levántate y ándale. And somebody, shouted from his followers, levántate, pendejo. And he said, yes, estuvo pendejo por un rato, pero luego se compuso. So the good news is that as Lazarus, we're pendejos for a little while, but we can be cured of that. We can become lucid. We can understand the transitory nature of reality. We can understand that every phenomenon emerges on dependence of causes and circumstances and is created by mental designation. We can understand the fact that nothing possesses intrinsic identity. This is something very profound. When you're in a non-lucid dream and you're exposed to some type of dream appearance, let's say the chocolate cake. The chocolate cake seems to exist objectively from its own side, independently of the mind that is dreaming it, as it appears as a chocolate cake. The same happens, in the waking state. If you're to be exposed to a chocolate cake, you would never doubt the identity that it apparently manifests. You would be convinced that it exists as a chocolate cake. But the fact is that the cake doesn't have an intrinsic identity. It is not intrinsically chocolate or cake. Because the cakeness and the chocolateness of the cake is a mental designation on behalf of the perceptor. If you doubt it, you could run an experiment. You could take that chocolate cake, pack it very well, put upon it some type of little parachute. You could fly it over the Amazon. You could liberate it, and see how perhaps an Aborigine would receive it. And if that person has never been exposed to a cake before in his life, he would not recognize it as a cake. Perhaps he would think of it as some type of divine gift. Perhaps he would set it up in an altar. He would literally not know what it is, because the cake does not have any type of intrinsic identity, independent of mental designation. Let's take my example tonight. I'm a speaker, but do I have that type of intrinsic identity? Am I an intrinsic speaker? Well, you can ask my family. And they would definitely witness the fact that I don't have that intrinsic identity. No? For instance, with great difficulties, I command your attention tonight. But there's no way I can command any type of attention from my family any night. No? When I'm at home, nobody regards me as something special. When I'm in my car, nobody stops and says, Dr. Karam. No? Please, before me. No? When I get to a toll, nobody says, it's for free, Dr. Karam. No? Because I don't have any type of intrinsic identity. But we are attached to that fantasy, that mind-created idea of how we think we exist, and we suffer. The Buddha said that sentient beings suffer because we're attached to an identity which we do not have. We suffer because we try to possess that which does not belong to us. Now think about that. What is it that truly belongs to us? Does your body belong to you? Does your car belong to you? Do your kids belong to you? Does your house belong to you? Everything is simply given to you for a little while. You're a temporal administrator of everything that you think you own. Nothing, without exception, is owned by you. But we tend to think that we truly own everything around us. And we make great efforts to have it become permanent, not to change, to always produce the same effect upon us, which is something simply impossible, unviable, because it does not correspond to the nature of everything that we interact with. So we're ignorant about the basic nature of things. We're ignorant about the fact that everything is impermanent, changing moment by moment. Not only that, we're, as Saint Teresa of Avila used to say, not only are we ignorant, but we're ignorant with initiative. In what sense? We ignore the impermanent nature of things, but we project permanence upon that which is impermanent. We're ignorant of the fact that nothing possesses intrinsic identity, but we project intrinsic identity upon everything that does not possess it. And when we contaminate our experience with this type of distortion, we suffer. Because we're not lucid. But that is not our basic nature. We have the potentiality to become lucid. And what happens when we're lucid? We can liberate ourselves from the tyranny of external appearances. We can understand that we're creating our reality and the experience that we have of it moment by moment. And therefore, there's no limit to what we can do. We can dream ourselves awake. And that is something incredibly exciting, isn't it? So, I know you're all tired. I would like to end with just a little story, if I can find it. The end of my presentation. And it says, a quote by Leo Tolstoy. And he said, as we live through thousands of dreams in our present life, so our present life is only one of many thousands of such lives which we enter from the other more real life and then return after death. Our life is but one of the dreams of that more real life. And so it is endlessly until the every last one, the very real life, the life of the Spirit. Thank you very much. Thank you.